is that the primary reason trans people transition is to alleviate gender dysphoria. This is what motivated me to transition, and I endorse the mainstream scientific view. According to Blanchard, trans women are driven to transition primarily by sexual motivations. He didn't really bother to think about trans men or non-binary people, so you all are excused. You can just grab a beer and laugh it up.
First of all, he did look at trans men, and he acknowledged that there was a homosexual type of trans men, and almost all the ones that came through his clinic at that time, except for a couple, as we had mentioned, were of the homosexual type, or at least stated that they were homosexual. And so my first disagreement here is that she's misrepresenting Blanchard's research in that he did actually study trans men, and he just found that they seemed to all be one type, at least the ones that came through his clinic at that time. And so he didn't create a typology for them because there's just seemingly one type.
A non-binary?
That term didn't exist until 2011. So yes, we can criticize Blanchard for not having a time machine and foreseeing non-binary, but no, I can't even, the thing about non-binary is the word did not exist at the time. So you can't critique Blanchard for that.
Something I noticed at ContraPoints is to sort of deflate ideas. She kind of adds in a stroke of comedy and sort of sensationalism, which sort of...
Yeah, she's funny. Yeah.
Wrecks the issue, but if you pick it apart, it's like, okay.
Cluster B trans women are mostly gynephilic, attracted to women, transition relatively later in life, and have outwardly boyish childhoods. When I first thought about this typology, it initially seemed pretty valid. Think of a trans woman who followed all the cluster A patterns but now dates women, and a trans woman who followed all the cluster B patterns but now exclusively dates men. So I have a lot of backup here since trans women almost universally reject this characterization of their experience. Now you'd think that'd be a major problem for the theory, but fortunately, Blanchard has an airtight response to that, namely that trans women who disagree with him are fucking liars. I mean, that's really the scientific ideal, isn't it? A theory that can't be falsified. It's perfect.
So Blanchard did not say that the ones that disagree with him are liars. He's made clear that there's a lot of reasons why if someone is reporting on the personal experience that they may be reporting inaccurately, and that even really honest people trying to tell the truth might report on their experience inaccurately. So he never said that they were lying. He did find that there was a correlation between social desirability bias, where the tendency to present yourself in a flattering light, that this did seem to correlate with. So what I'm mentioning here was not specifically of transsexuals, it was just gender dysphoric males and transvestites at the clinic. There was a correlation between the tendency to want to present yourself in a favorable light and then also reporting more attraction to men, more childhood gender nonconformity, and also like denial of cross-gender eroticism. So Blanchard never said that they're all lying. He said that they could be misreporting for plenty of different reasons, and it's not even necessarily intentional.
And what about her argument that says type A is attracted to men, type B is attracted to women, but then after transitioning, she's known them to both flip?
There's meta-attraction. Meta-attraction is when you're attracted to someone because of what their traits say about you. With autoheterosexuality, but I guess specifically with autogynephilia, meta-androphilia is when you'll be attracted to being a woman with a man, to playing like a female sex role counterpart to a man. And this is supposedly the source of, in autogynephilic individuals, their attraction to men is ultimately from this meta-attraction. And it can alter their attractions over their life. Maybe at first they won't feel much meta attraction, or later it'll develop. They'll suddenly have no interest in women anymore and just want to be with men. Blanchard called it pseudo-bisexuality. Kurt Freund called it pseudo-androphilia. Nowadays, online, it's called meta-attraction. And it does not discount the typology. It's a known thing that transsexuals will report changes to their sexual orientation, and I think meta-attraction is likely what's causing it.
Based off what you said before, it would make sense in terms of, you said some AGPs are always kind of looking for the next thing to validate their womanhood. So if the clothing is available, they'll do that. If the transition is available, they'll do that. But perhaps when the identity is fully formed, then that is the ultimate next step, isn't it, to be in that relationship?
Well, once that identity has formed, then the precondition for the attraction to men, it then becomes possible to be attracted to men. You wouldn't be attracted to men unless you could be a female counterpart to them. So once they see themselves as women, that opens up the possibility of meta-attraction and acting upon it.
Right. And what about gay men transitioning now being attracted to women, she claims? Is there any evidence of that?
I think that happens much less often. However, again, the same principle of it could theoretically happen through the meta attraction, where like there's some autogynephiles that are only interested in men, but it's like the meta attraction to men. And I could see that there could be a person that before transition, they only want to be with men, they just want to be a gay bottom. And then after transitioning, the transitioning would fulfill a lot of their need for feminine embodiment. And I would kind of expect at that point, after a year or two, that they might then realize that they're actually attracted to women too.
So they could be bisexual from the start.
Yeah, meta attraction is really, I think it's responsible for all the fluctuations in partner preferences among transsexuals. It depends on the case by case basis how it manifests, but I still think there's a case of someone that's just a gay man pre-transition and then after transition is attracted to women. I think that person was just autogynephilic the whole time.
Right. Very interesting. Okay, I'll keep going.
I'm a 29-year-old transsexual with a history of dating women and cross-dressing in erotic situations, no less. According to Blanchard's theory, I'm therefore an autogynephile. And I didn't fantasize about having sex with women or with men, or even about becoming a woman. My fantasies were kind of platonic almost. I would sort of fantasize about women, but in a very abstract kind of way. An early romantic disappointment involved my realization that women would never be attracted to me in the same way that I was attracted to them. In my late teens and early 20s, I was a long-haired, smooth-chested androgyne, which suited me well. It was around then that I first cross-dressed, when a woman I was seeing asked if she could dress me up in her clothes and do my makeup. God, yes, I said. Throughout my 20s, I was on and off in relationships where there was this feminization dynamic. More women are into feminizing boys than you might think. When I was feminized, we would just make out and not do anything penetrative, but just sort of little proto-lesbian things, Now, some women I was with were not into that, and some would practically lock their underwear drawers when they found out I had done it in the past. There was one period where I cut my hair short and quit that altogether, but it didn't last more than a couple years. When I had regular heterosexual sex, it was like my soul had to leave my body in order for me to get the poison out, which is how I thought of it. The cross-dressing was never a solo or a masturbatory activity. There was always a partner, or sometimes several partners. What I liked about it was the way that dressing like a woman changed the way partners interacted with my body, how they would kind of treat me like a woman. I fully acknowledge that a lot of the feminization was pretty fetishistic. There was a lot of short dresses and thigh highs, and occasionally also a BDSM submissive aspect. But over time I realized that the fetish aspect wasn't really what I liked about it. It wasn't humiliating for me to be feminized, it was affirming. And one day I kind of realized that I didn't want to be feminized at all. I wanted to be feminine. At the same time, I realized that I would have to transition to have any hope of a genuinely fulfilling sex life. I find myself attracted to both women and men, and the mere visual image of a woman no longer turns me on the way it did. Instead, I need there to be a certain kind of interpersonal connection. I don't masturbate at all, and I haven't come in months. Someone, please fuck me. I guess the critical thing is that I've been wearing women's clothes, my clothes, for 7 consecutive months, and I have been turned on by it for 0% of the time. So the idea that I'm some kind of transvestic fetishist is ridiculous. So as always, my sex drive is directed outward at other people. The sexual aspect of my transsexuality is not about the target of lust being directed inward. It's about me wanting my sexual encounters to occur from the standpoint of a female body, or, at least as close as I can get.
This is pretty textbook autogynephilia here.
But somehow it's an argument against it at the same time.
Well, she even mentioned that like her only chance of having a fulfilling sex life would be if she could transition. And, if you do have autogynephilia to a degree that it's your strongest sexual interest, that will be the case for some people, that you can't have a satisfying sex life unless you transition. And so I don't think her strong desire to be feminine rules out the autogynephilic explanation for this. And especially, she mentioned how during intercourse, she felt like her soul was leaving her body. That sort of dissociation I've seen in plenty of narratives from autogynephilic people. They can physically perform the act of heterosexual intercourse, but they kind of have to dissociate from themselves in the moment to make it happen. And so that's what she says is like her soul leaving her body. I see that as basically her feminine self can't be in her body in that moment.
With heterosexual sex as a man, she's like in the role she doesn't feel she should be.
Right. It's just an alien role that she can't relate to, and it's off-putting, and she wants to be in the other one.
What about the claim that there was never a masturbatory component to feeling like a woman? She kind of claims that it was never about myself, it was more about me wanting to be a woman with other people.
In other parts of the clip, she did mention that masturbation would be sort of like involve contemplative imagery of women just in general, not necessarily like having sex with one, but just like contemplating women. And also that some of her first experiences with cross-dressing were quite erotic. And when she mentioned that one of her partners offered to dress her up, and then her response is basically like, God, yes, that's what you'd expect if there was someone that like if autogynephilia is behind this, but she hadn't been able to express it in a satisfactory manner. Like if you had this great unmet need for so long and then all of a sudden there was a chance to act on it, yeah, you're going to have strong feelings and a lot of interest in acting on that.
Yeah, really good observation.
I've noticed that cis men seem to really like their own penises and taking pictures of their penises and sending them to other people. Does that make them autoandrophiles? I know a cis woman who, having just bought some expensive lingerie, told me, "It's not for men, it's for me." What does that mean? It means she enjoyed wearing sexy lingerie under her clothes because it made her feel hot. Is that cisvestic autogynephilia? Likewise, I used to date cis women. I know what they do, and I can tell you that women touching their own breasts during sex or while masturbating is not at all uncommon. Is that anatomical autogynephilia? When I had male hormones in me, I needed to have an orgasm every day. I was turned on mainly by visual arousal cues. I was at a Kinsey 1 relative to my birth sex, and I had a couple mild, typical, straight guy paraphilic kinks. No, not autogynephilia. On female hormones, I initially had no sex drive at all, but have started developing very different patterns of arousal. For instance, I never need to have an orgasm. I'm turned on mainly by interpersonal cues like intimate physical contact or close emotional moments. I'm at around a 70-30 attraction to women versus men, and the paraphilic kinks have vanished without a trace. One of the reasons why Blanchard has to come up with elaborate terminology like this is he takes as foundational the presupposition that trans women are psychologically more like cis men than cis women. His studies therefore lack a cis female control group, meaning he didn't bother to apply his autogynephilia survey to cis women. But if he had, as Charles Moser did in 2009, he might have found that many of them were classified as autogynephilic. Blanchard's insistence on classifying trans women's sexuality as a variant on male sexuality makes it seem paraphilic and unusual that trans women want to have sex as women. But what do cis women want to have sex as? Walruses? I mean, no judgments.
She is funny. I do like her. Like, just yeah, I just want to be clear about that. Like, as much as I do think,
Yeah,
like,
I respect ContraPoints.
yeah, she's funny. So her point about how Blanchard's research didn't have any control groups of females, there's no reason for them to. Blanchard was trying to understand gender dysphoria in males. Earlier, he did study females too, but at least at the time he was at the clinic, it seemed that only one type came through. There wasn't like an autoandrophilic type. So Blanchard's research does not have any control groups of cis women, but it also shouldn't because they're not of the sex that he was trying to understand. Also, autogynephilia in women has been studied by that Moser study she pointed out, that magnificent N of 29 study. That study used modified versions of questions that were on various scales of Blanchard's. So it doesn't directly correspond to any of the scales Blanchard used. So it's hard to directly compare it. However, Michael Bailey did a study on autogynephilia in women with a much larger sample size than Charles Moser's 29. There was hundreds in this study that Michael Bailey did, and he had a couple separate groups of women. He tested in a couple different groups of women, a group of like regular cis men, and then a group of AGP men, and compared all these groups. And the autogynephilic men had the most autogynephilia. You know, there was some autogynephilia reported by cis women, but it's at much lower levels than is seen in the autogynephilic men. It's nowhere near the high proportions that were reported in Moser's tiny study.
The comparison, though, it's funny to me anyway, because even if women express these feelings, it still brings us back to the idea of why are men feeling this way about being women, because they're not women. So
right,
it's still a complete phenomenon in that case. And
yeah, I really don't think the sort of sexual behaviors that like regularly heterosexual women do, that it just doesn't seem like autogynephilia is typical female sexuality based on my understanding of autogynephilia. And, you know, like the things I pointed out, when this has been looked into with women, they don't report autogynephilia nearly as much as the autogynephilic men do.
Would you interpret a lot of these trans lesbians on TikTok claiming to have periods or to lactate? Would you see those as elements of their AGP? Because obviously the majority of straight women would not feel that way about their period or...
Right, yeah. That's physiologic autogynephilia. Blanchard gave a label to that, and that was even observed in the first good narrative in the sexology literature. It was appeared in Psychopathia Sexualis and by Kraft-Ebing, there's this narrative where there's this natal male who felt like a woman, and they regularly had like phantom period symptoms that began every month at the full moon, and they had various bodily sensations associated with that. So it seemed, and this was all before hormones were even isolated, identified, or even synthesized. So this person was not on estrogen. This was just autogynephilia causing it.
Wow. Do you think a lot of those trans women actually believe they have a period, or do some of them get a kick out of imposing it on others, this idea?
I don't think just in general, I don't think that people get a kick out of like imposing things on others, so to speak.
Yeah.
But they do. There's an strong emotional satisfaction to it because it's strongly symbolic of femininity to have those things. And so some of them will experience positive feelings from observing these things within themselves.
But would some of them know that it's not true, but say it anyway, or?
It's hard for me to know like their inner thoughts about whether they know it's true.
Worse, I just always wonder with those TikTokers whether they're getting a thrill out of publicly saying it, but they know deep down that it's actually not true. I'm not sure.
With discourse among trans women online, it is normal. The people that say that they're in a discussion of trans women online, if a couple of them start saying that no, we don't get periods, that's whatever that is, that's we don't get those, they'll get kind of shouted down. So the subset of the population that believes that trans women can have periods is culturally in control within this population.
He also explains his claim that non-exclusively androphilic trans women are pseudo-bisexual because their attraction to men does not resemble gay male attraction to men. The idea is that these trans women's attraction to men is not based on raw physical lust, so it is therefore unlike gay male attraction to men, and is therefore pseudo. That is, it's really an autogynephilic fantasy where the man is just a prop. But what about straight cis women's attraction to men? Is that based on raw physical lust for the male body? I mean, sometimes it probably is, and I'm not a cis woman, so I can't really say. But I kind of suspect that cis female heterosexuality is not best described as raw physical lust for the male body. That is, I suspect it's quite different from cis male homosexuality, if I may risk painting with broad strokes. Take the case of Playgirl magazine, which at its peak published feminist articles alongside naked hunks, but never had the circulation of its male counterpart, and later on ended up just being read by gay men. From the perspective of female sexuality, I mean, men's bodies are nice, they have great hands, great abs, great this part, it's all great. But it's not that great. And if you read pornography written by women, and notice that it's usually written and not photographed, you don't find a predominant focus on vivid descriptions of male bodies.
When she says male bodies aren't that great, I just have to disagree with that very strongly.
Right. I'm sure you resonate with the part where all the arrows were pointing to all the different parts that looked good.
For sure.
Though.
Sure.
Her observations about the differences between male and female sexuality, I agree. She's right about this, that females seem to be less strictly visually anatomically focused and tend to prefer erotica, and yeah, their sexuality is less simplistic. However, that is female sexuality, and we're talking about trans women here, which are biologically of the male sex. So it's this language thing where Blanchard's theory tries to explain male gender dysphoria, but when ContraPoints is talking about it, she's using terms like cis women, trans women, cis men, and trans men, and it obscures the importance of biological sex here to understanding what's going on.
Yeah, that's my point. It's kind of, she's trying to say that because I have these feelings and cis women have similar feelings, we're the same, but the whole point of the typology to begin with is that you're male, and that's why it's so strange.
Right. Yeah, it's to explain why males want to be female. It's not to explain why anyone wants to be female. We don't need to explain people that have no issue with their sex. Like, I think that's probably just the default. We have to explain these strange outlier cases, and that's the point of Blanchard's typology.
Well, a lot of this stuff, like fantasies of being women or having sex as women or arousal during cross-dressing, are what the trans community has destigmatizingly termed cross-sex gender fantasy. My thinking is that it's pretty hard to experience genuine female sexuality when you've still got the evil magic of testosterone in your system, so you've got to get that out, and then this paraphilic stuff tends to go away. Blanchard's theory claims that cross-sex gender fantasy or arousal is causal and essential. In this theory, theory, if you're an autogynephilic transsexual, you are essentially male, and any facsimile of womanhood you achieve can only be honestly understood as the expression of an essentially male sexual urge. I reject the idea that it's causal or essential, and I think the strongest piece of evidence that it isn't essential is that even the rare trans women who identify as autogynephilic admit that after transition, the cross-sex fantasy and arousal vanishes, yet they continue to prefer living as trans women. As trans women are essentially men with a paraphilic desire to become women, why would they continue preferring to live as women after the paraphilic desires go away? Corsets, the high heels, these were primitive efforts at clawing my way out of manhood, and they're efforts that I've left behind. Now that I'm on female hormones and I live this way full time, I feel the way I'm supposed to feel, and I don't need to lean on that stuff for validation. I mean, I still do some things that cis women don't do. I sleep in a bra, which I'm pretty sure no cis woman has ever done. I do it because I need to feel something, God, anything, taking up space on my chest. And feeling that reassures me enough that I can fall asleep.
Right. What she's describing there about feeling comfortable and reassured by symbolizing breasts is like, that's very common among autogynephilic individuals. And earlier, her pointing out that, the trans community acknowledges that as she termed it, cross-sex gender fantasies occur. She and others dispute that they're indicative or causal for the development of trans identity. However, if the trans community has terminology for these cross-sex fantasies because they're quite common, perhaps that indicates whatever it is that causes those fantasies is quite common in them. Also points out that a trans woman might feel like they're autogynephilic before transition and have cross-gender fantasies, but then after transitioning that goes away. Yeah, that is what you'd expect for a couple of reasons. First of all, you're kind of nuking your libido with the estrogen and the anti-androgens. And secondly, you're embodying femininity in a much deeper, more full-time way that is just more consistently present. Mm-hmm. And so I think that will sort of diminish the response. It basically feels like nothing. It feels like normal, and it just feels proper and the way things should be.
It all makes sense to me. It's funny just watching the whole video. She admits 95% of what autogynephilia is, but to me it kind of comes across as an unwillingness to accept the term while also admitting to sort of the criteria of that term.
And I see that a lot, that trans women will readily acknowledge the sort of fantasies that are labeled as autogynephilia while strenuously arguing against the theory that says that those fantasies are indicative of that underlying sexual orientation and that those caused gender transition. Trans people as a whole do not really contest the fact that these sort of cross-sex fantasies exist or that they're common in trans people. They just dispute their meaning and their cause and where they come from.
That makes sense. So, very well debunked. Any final words on Contra?
I won't necessarily call it debunking just because I'm so sick of seeing that term used to refer to Blanchard's obviously correct theory.
Great reaction to her anyway.
Thank you. Yeah. I watched her autogynephilia video a few times in my first year of learning about autogynephilia. And as far as I could tell, it's someone describing a pretty typical progression from something that is sort of an unmet longing that then finally gets some sexual expression that is very exciting at first and more overtly sexually expressed, but then over time becomes something that they just want to incorporate to a bigger part of their lives. Like she said, she didn't want to be feminized, she wanted to be feminine. There's this progression from an occasional sexual interest to something you want to embody full time as a deeply important part of your identity is a pretty typical progression with autosexual trans identity.
That's clear. And so would you agree that with homosexual type trans women, femininity can sometimes be more natural to them from an early age, whereas a lot of the AGP type actually are quite masculine, initially? Yeah,
there's sort of a natural essentialist difference here, innate difference in masculinity and femininity between the two types. But also, I would say societal conditions also have an impact on this, because if there's AGPs, it's common for AGPs to have memories of maybe trying some feminine expressions as a child, but then being ridiculed for it and then bottling it up and suppressing it down. Whereas the sort of society we're moving into where that happens less often, I think it'll make it so there are these children that are motivated to do cross-gender behaviors ultimately because of their later revealed sexuality, that they will appear more naturally feminine because they will get to practice that femininity from a younger age and have it be incorporated into their self without having such a strong male self built up.
Yeah.
And so it'll start to blur as transsexual males start to transition at earlier ages. The two types will start to become a little less obvious, just like on a superficial level.
Then that, because gay kids would also be scolded or told that it's wrong.
Right, but they can't help it.
That's what I mean, is like, why can the AGPs suppress it, but the gay kids can't?
With the AGP one, it's like a desire to do the thing. And you could, if you're ridiculed in your first few expressions of it, you could feel ashamed about it, especially because ultimately there's sexuality underlying it, even if you're not consciously aware of it. There's just going to be more propensity for feeling ashamed about it.
Right, yeah. And then what are your feelings on this learned femininity? Because with ContraPoints and Philosophy Tube, looking at their material before, especially with Philosophy Tube, I'm just like, whoa, like it's hard for me to imagine that being natural to Philosophy Tube, going from this like very, very masculine man to then this different voice. And even with ContraPoints, like now I listen to her voice and it's pretty convincing, but there's an element I'm kind of like, is this very consciously put on all the time?
At first it's a very conscious put on, and through repetition and consistency it becomes something that just becomes the thoughtless and normal. But there's quite a long period of time, years, months and years, where it's something you have to intentionally think about. And that's part of the difficulty of transitioning.
When you see a gay man transition, it's kind of like, oh yeah, not much has changed. You may have had some surgery or grown your hair. But when I look at Philosophy Tube's videos are all still up. So you look at an older one, you look at a recent one, and it's like, oh my gosh, these are two different people.
Yeah, Philosophy Tube is obviously probably of the same ideology, as ContraPoints. But ContraPoints, this isn't like my scientific opinion, this is just my opinion on looking at them, that ContraPoints it does better at pulling off a feminine aesthetic, and she does it more tastefully, and there's no creepy vibes from her at all. Whereas like Philosophy Tube is not the same. And
I can really empathize with women when they see a man transition, and a man goes from that to then a different voice. Like, I can see why they would find that offensive, Can you understand that?
To some extent. But on the other hand, like if there was a woman that was transitioning and then intentionally doing voice training to talk deeper, I wouldn't be personally offended by that. Like, so
I guess it's just because they'll just argue like, oh, well, you're not oppressed as a man, like we've been. That would be their argument.
Right. That's always their argument. Like, okay, fine, I'm not oppressed at all. I just had thousands of rabid TERFs yell at me for wearing a dress. But I'm not oppressed at all.
Not at all.